Tonight we step into a vault that was never meant to be opened. Not by priests, not by scholars, not by anyone. For centuries the Vatican has stood as the guardian of faith, the keeper of sacred truth. But beneath the marble halls and golden altars lies something else entirely. A collection of prophecies so disturbing, so specific, so dangerous that they were buried the moment they were written. These are not myths. These are not legends whispered in dusty corners. These are documented visions, sealed letters, and forbidden manuscripts that predict the fall of empires, the end of the Church itself, and events unfolding right now in our world. Some were written by saints, others by popes, a few by visionaries whose names were erased from history the moment they spoke too much. What makes these prophecies different is not that they were wrong, it's that they were right, and the Vatican knew it. So before you scroll past, ask yourself this: what could be so terrifying that the most powerful religious institution on earth would hide it for 1,000 years? Like the video. Subscribe, because tonight we open the forbidden archive. And once you hear what's inside, you'll understand why some truths were never meant to see light. There is a room in the Vatican that doesn't appear on any official tour. No velvet ropes guide visitors toward it. No glass cases display its contents. It sits buried beneath layers of stone and silence, locked behind doors that require more than keys. They require clearance that most cardinals will never receive. Inside are shelves lined with manuscripts, letters, and scrolls that were never meant to be read twice. This is not the famous Vatican secret archives, where historians occasionally gain access to yellowed papal letters. This is something else, something older, something that even archivists speak of only in whispers. They call it the Propheterum Silentium, the silence of the prophets. For centuries, visionaries have claimed to receive messages from beyond. Some spoke of saints appearing in visions. Others described angels delivering warnings. A few claimed to see the future itself, vivid and unavoidable, laid out before them like a map already drawn. The Church has always handled these claims carefully. Some were canonized, turned into miracles, used to inspire the faithful. But others, the ones that didn't fit the narrative, the ones that threatened the structure itself, those were silenced. Not destroyed. The Vatican rarely destroys knowledge. It buries it. And that is where the archive comes in. When a prophecy is deemed too dangerous to share, it follows a specific path. First, the visionary is questioned. Their words are recorded in exact detail by scribes who serve the holy office. Then the document is sealed, stamped with wax, and carried down into the depths of the Vatican. It is catalogued under a system so obscure that even finding the list requires permission from the Pope himself. Some entries are labeled only with numbers, others with symbols. A few have warnings written in Latin across the covers. Aperier non licet. Do not open. But what makes a prophecy dangerous? Why would the Church, which claims to serve divine truth, hide visions that are supposed to come from God? The answer is simple and terrifying, because some of these prophecies don't just predict the future. They reveal the past. They expose lies, unmask deceptions, and point to moments in history where the Church chose power over truth. And worst of all, many of them have come true. Not in vague symbolic ways that can be explained away, but in precise, undeniable detail. One such document dates back to the year 1139. It was written by a bishop named Malachi, an Irish monk who claimed to have received a vision during a pilgrimage to Rome. In that vision, he saw every pope who would ever reign from his time until the end of the church itself. He wrote down 112 short phrases, each describing a future pope through symbols, names, or events tied to their reign. For centuries, the prophecies sat in the Vatican archives, mostly ignored. But as time passed, something strange happened. The descriptions began to match. Pope after pope, the phrases aligned with their lives in ways that could not be dismissed as coincidence. By the 20th century, scholars began to pay attention. The prophecy had predicted wars, scandals, and even the names of certain popes with eerie accuracy. But what truly unsettled the Vatican was the final line. The 112th pope, according to Malachi, would oversee the destruction of Rome and the end of the Church as it had existed for 2,000 years. And when you count the popes, when you trace the line from 1139 to today, you realize we are living in the time of that final prophecy. The Church has never officially acknowledged the prophecy of the popes. It has never been taught in seminaries or discussed in sermons. Instead, it has been quietly filed away, mentioned only in academic circles, dismissed by church officials as medieval superstition. But the fact remains. It exists, it is documented, and it is still unfolding. Then there are the Fatima secrets, visions received by 3 children in Portugal in 1917. The Virgin Mary appeared to them, they said, and revealed 3 prophecies. The first 2 were eventually made public. They spoke of wars, the rise of communism, and suffering that would sweep across Europe. Both came true, but the third secret, the final vision, was kept locked in a vault for decades. When it was finally released in the year 2000, the Vatican claimed it referred to the assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II. A tidy explanation, a safe interpretation. But many who have studied the original documents believe that what was released was edited, softened, or incomplete. Whispers persist among scholars and former clergy that the true third secret spoke not of an assassination, but of apostasy, a vision of the Church collapsing from within, of priests losing faith, of altars left empty, and of Rome itself falling into ruin. If true, then the Vatican had every reason to bury it, because a prophecy that predicts the Church's own destruction cannot be preached from the pulpit. It cannot be used to inspire the faithful. It can only create doubt. And doubt, in the eyes of the institution, is more dangerous than any external enemy. What is most unsettling is how many of these prophecies share common themes. Across centuries, across continents, visionaries who never met, who spoke different languages, who lived in different eras, all described similar events. A time of great crisis, a moment when the Church would be tested and found wanting, a period of darkness before an uncertain dawn. Some spoke of it as divine judgment, others as a necessary collapse to make way for renewal. But all agreed on one thing. The Church as we know it would not survive in its current form. The Vatican has spent centuries managing these prophecies. Some were released in controlled doses, interpreted in ways that reinforced Church authority. Others were locked away entirely, accessible only to a select few who swore oaths of secrecy. And a handful, it is rumored, were destroyed, not because they were false, but because they were too true, because they named names, pointed to corruption, and revealed secrets that could shatter the foundations of faith for millions. Why does the Vatican fear prophecy? Because prophecy, by its nature, cannot be controlled. It does not bow to doctrine. It does not wait for approval. It speaks, and once spoken, it cannot be unspoken. And when a prophecy comes from within the church, from saints, from mystics, from those who claim to hear the voice of God, it carries a weight that no amount of theological explanation can dismiss. To deny it is to deny the very source of divine revelation the Church claims to protect. So the prophecies remain sealed, catalogued, waiting. Some predict dates that have not yet arrived. Others describe events still unfolding in our world. And a few, the most dangerous of all, suggest that the end is not a distant apocalypse, but a slow unraveling already in motion. A church losing its grip, a world questioning its authority, and a truth buried so deep that even those who guard it no longer remember why it was hidden in the first place. This is not about faith. This is about fear. Fear of what the future holds, fear of what the past concealed, and fear that the prophecies locked in the Vatican vaults were never warnings meant to be heeded. They were confessions written by those who saw too much and spoke too soon. On May 13, 1917, 3 shepherd children stood in a field near Fatima, Portugal, watching the sky tear open. At least that is how they described it. Lucia dos Santos, age 10, and her younger cousins Francisco and Jacinta Marto claimed that a woman clothed in light appeared above an oak tree. She spoke to them, not with words they heard, but with thoughts they understood. She told them she would return on the 13th of each month for 6 months. And she did. Thousands gathered to witness the final apparition in October, when witnesses reported seeing the sun dance, spin, and plunge toward the earth before returning to its place in the sky. The Church investigated, and eventually it canonized the event as a miracle. But what the lady revealed to the children during those visits became one of the most closely guarded secrets in Vatican history. She gave them 3 prophecies. The first predicted the end of World War I and warned of a greater war to come if humanity did not change its ways. The second spoke of the rise of Russia and the spread of atheistic communism across the world. Both prophecies were documented and both came true with chilling precision. But the third secret, the final vision shown to the children, remained locked away for over 80 years. Lucia, the only one of the 3 to survive into adulthood, wrote down the third secret in 1944 under orders from her bishop. She sealed it in an envelope and sent it to the Vatican with explicit instructions. It was not to be opened until 1960, or upon her death, whichever came first. The reasoning, she said, was that by 1960 the message would be clearer. The world would understand. But when 1960 arrived, the Vatican did not release the document. Pope John XXIII read it privately, then ordered it resealed. He gave no explanation. The silence spoke louder than any statement could. Decades passed. Rumors spread. Theologians speculated. Some believed the third secret foretold nuclear war. Others thought it described the assassination of a pope. A few whispered that it spoke of apostasy, of priests abandoning their faith, of the church collapsing from within. The mystery grew heavier with every passing year. Then, in the year 2000, the Vatican finally made an announcement. Cardinal Angelo Sodano stood before a crowd at Fatima and revealed the third secret. He described a vision of a bishop dressed in white, walking through a ruined city, climbing a mountain of corpses, and being shot down by soldiers. The Vatican interpreted this as a prophecy of the 1981 assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II. The Pope had survived. The prophecy, they said, had been fulfilled. The announcement was meant to close the chapter, to put the rumors to rest. But it did the opposite, because those who read the released text noticed something strange. The vision described in the official document was shorter than expected. It contained no words, only images, and it ended abruptly, as if something had been left out. Lucia herself, still alive at the time, remained silent. She gave no interviews. She offered no clarification, and when asked directly by journalists whether the released version was complete, she said only that she had done her duty and could say no more. What fueled suspicion was a comment made years earlier by Cardinal Ratzinger, the future Pope Benedict XVI, in an interview before the secret was released. He said the third secret concerned the dangers threatening the faith and the life of the Christian, and therefore the world. He spoke of entire nations disappearing from the earth, of apostasy within the Church, and of insufficient pastoral care for the faithful. None of that appeared in the 2000 release. Instead, the Vatican presented a single symbolic image and called it complete. Some researchers began digging deeper. They uncovered testimonies from clergy who claimed to have seen earlier drafts of the document. One Portuguese priest said he had been shown a version that included 25 lines of text in which the Virgin Mary spoke directly about a great crisis of faith. Another account came from a German journalist who interviewed a high-ranking Vatican official in the 1990s. The official, speaking off the record, said the true third secret described a loss of faith at the highest levels of the Church. Bishops doubting doctrine, cardinals losing belief, and a pope who would lead the faithful into confusion rather than clarity. If these testimonies are credible, then what the Vatican released in 2000 was not the full secret. It was an edited version, carefully chosen to fit an event that had already occurred. By connecting the prophecy to the assassination attempt, the Church could claim fulfillment without addressing the darker, more disturbing elements of the original vision. A vision that spoke not of external enemies, but of internal decay. There is another curious detail. In the official text, the vision shows a bishop in white being killed by soldiers. But Pope John Paul II was not killed. He survived the attack. So how could the prophecy be considered fulfilled? The Vatican's explanation was that the assassination attempt itself was the event foretold, and the Pope's survival was a sign of divine mercy. But that interpretation requires accepting that a prophecy about death can be fulfilled by survival. It stretches credulity. Then there is the testimony of Father Nicholas Gruner, a Canadian priest who spent decades researching Fatima. He claimed to have spoken with Vatican insiders who confirmed that the third secret contained explicit warnings about apostasy, about a false council within the Church, and about Rome losing the faith and becoming the seat of the Antichrist. Gruner was marginalized by the Vatican, his priestly faculties eventually suspended. He died in 2016, still insisting that the full secret had never been revealed. What makes the Fatima prophecy so dangerous is not just what it might say, but what it represents. If the Virgin Mary, speaking through children, warned of the Church's own corruption and collapse, then the institution built on that faith must either confront the prophecy or bury it. Confronting it would mean admitting that the structure is flawed, that reform is urgent, that the warnings were real. Burying it allows the institution to continue as if nothing is wrong, to dismiss critics as conspiracy theorists, and to maintain control over the narrative. But prophecies have a way of insisting on themselves. Even buried, they resurface. Even silenced, they echo. In recent years, the Church has faced scandals that mirror the warnings of Fatima. Priests losing faith, bishops covering up abuse, cardinals embroiled in financial corruption, entire dioceses emptying as believers walk away. The pews grow sparse, the vocations dwindle, and the institution struggles to explain why the faithful no longer trust those who claim to speak for God. Some believers argue that the third secret is unfolding right now, that the apostasy foretold is not a distant event, but a present reality, that the crisis of faith is not coming, it has arrived, and that the Vatican's refusal to release the full text is itself a fulfillment of the prophecy, a sign that those in power would rather protect the institution than serve the truth. Others believe the secret contains something even more specific: dates, names, events yet to occur, a timeline of the Church's final days. And if that is true, then the Vatican's silence is not just about avoiding scandal. It is about avoiding panic, because once people know when and how the end will come, they will either prepare or abandon ship, and either outcome threatens the power structure that has endured for 2 millennia. In 2017, on the 100th anniversary of the Fatima apparitions, Pope Francis visited the site. He spoke of mercy, of hope, of the Virgin's intercession, but he did not mention the third secret. He did not address the rumors. He did not clarify what had been released or what remained hidden. He simply stood in silence, as popes before him had done, guarding a mystery that grows heavier with time. What is clear is this: the third secret of Fatima was not a simple vision of martyrdom. It was something deeper, something that touched the core of the Church's identity. Whether it spoke of apostasy, of corruption, of a future schism, or of Rome itself falling into darkness, we may never know with certainty. But the fact that it remains contested, that insiders continue to claim the full version was never released, and that the Vatican's own statements contradict each other, tells us one thing. Whatever was written in that envelope, whatever Lucia saw in 1917, it was too dangerous to speak aloud. And silence, as always, is the loudest confession of all. In the year 1139, a man named Malachi arrived in Rome. He was an Irish bishop, known for his piety and his visions. During his visit to the Vatican, he claimed to receive a revelation so clear and so complete that it shook him to his core. He saw in sequence every pope who would ever lead the Catholic Church from that moment until its final days. He wrote down what he saw in a series of short Latin phrases, 112 in total, each describing a future pontiff through symbols, events, or names tied to their reign. Then he sealed the document and entrusted it to Pope Innocent II. For nearly 400 years, it vanished into the Vatican archives. Unread and forgotten, it resurfaced in 1595 when a Benedictine historian named Arnold de Wyan published it in his work on the lives of the saints. By then, over half of the prophecies had already unfolded, and when scholars checked them against history, they found something unsettling. The descriptions matched, not vaguely, but with precision that could not easily be dismissed. The prophecy did not give names or dates. Instead, it used phrases that became clear only after the fact. And that is what made it dangerous. Because once people began tracking the list, they realized it had an ending. The prophecies are brief, often just 2 or 3 words in Latin. For example, prophecy number 68 reads de medietate lunae, which means from the half-moon. This phrase was linked to Pope Gregory XIII, who reigned from 1572 to 1585. His papal coat of arms featured a half-moon. Prophecy 94, religio depopulata, meaning religion laid waste, was associated with Pope Benedict XV, who led the Church during World War I, a time when entire Christian populations were devastated. Prophecy 107, de labor solis, translated as from the labor of the sun, was connected to Pope John Paul II, who was born during a solar eclipse and buried during one. Skeptics argue that the prophecies are too vague, that any phrase can be made to fit any pope if you interpret it loosely enough. And it is true that some of the connections require creative reading. But what cannot be ignored is the sheer number of matches that require no stretching at all. Names, symbols, events, all aligning across centuries in ways that defy simple coincidence. And the most troubling part is not what has already happened. It is what remains that according to Malachi's list, there are only 112 popes. The final entry is longer than the others, almost like a eulogy. It reads, in persecution extrema sacri Romanae ecclesiae sedebit Petrus Romanus, qui passit ovus in multis tribulationibus, quibus transactus civitas septicalis deruder, et judex tremendus judicabit populum suum. Translated, it says, in the final persecution of the Holy Roman Church, there will reign Peter the Roman, who will feed his flock amid many tribulations, after which the 7-hilled city will be destroyed, and the dreadful judge will judge his people. The 7-hilled city is Rome. The prophecy speaks of its destruction, and Peter the Roman, the final pope, will oversee the end. Now count the popes from 1139 to today. Depending on how you tally, accounting for antipopes and disputed reigns, we are either at the 112th pope or very close to it. Pope Francis, the current pontiff, is often counted as number 112. If that is true, then, according to Malachi, we are living in the final chapter of the Catholic Church as it has existed. For 2,000 years, the Vatican has never officially endorsed the prophecy of the popes. In fact, church officials have gone out of their way to dismiss it as medieval forgery, a fabrication created in the 16th century to influence a papal election. The argument is that the prophecies are too accurate for the popes before 1595 and too vague for those after, suggesting someone wrote them retroactively and then added guesses for the future. It is a convenient explanation, but it does not account for the matches that came after 1595, matches that could not have been known or fabricated. Moreover, the prophecy's existence in Vatican archives before 1595 is documented in letters and references by church officials who mentioned it long before Arnold de Wyan published it. If it was a forgery, it was one created with extraordinary foresight and hidden so well that even the Vatican did not realize it was there. That level of conspiracy strains belief more than accepting that the prophecy might simply be what it claims to be, a vision. What makes the prophecy especially uncomfortable for the Church is its finality. It does not speak of renewal or reformation. It speaks of destruction. The 7 hills of Rome will fall. The flock will suffer tribulation. And the dreadful judge, whether interpreted as Christ, as divine justice, or as something else, will bring an end. This is not a message that inspires faith. It is a message that inspires fear. And fear, when tied to prophecy, can destabilize institutions. There is another disturbing detail. The name Peter the Roman does not match Pope Francis, whose birth name is Jorge Mario Bergoglio. He is not named Peter, and he is not Roman. He is Argentinian. So either the prophecy is wrong, or there is one more pope to come. Some interpreters believe Francis is not the final pope, but the second to last, and that his successor, perhaps taking the name Peter the Second in a symbolic return to the first apostle, will be the one who presides over the collapse. Others argue that the title Peter the Roman is metaphorical, representing the office of the papacy itself, the successor of Peter, the rock upon which the church was built. But there is a third interpretation, one that Vatican insiders whisper about but never confirm. What if Peter the Roman is not a single pope, but a description of what happens after the papacy ends? What if the prophecy is saying that in the final persecution, leadership will return to the people, to believers themselves, scattered and leaderless, each one a Peter in their own right, trying to hold faith together amid ruins? That interpretation turns the prophecy from a prediction of a final pope into a prediction of no pope at all, a church without Rome, a faith without hierarchy, a collapse so total that the structure itself dissolves. The church cannot publicly engage with this prophecy because doing so would legitimize it. To acknowledge Malachi would mean acknowledging that the end is written, that the timeline is fixed, and that no amount of reform or renewal can change what is coming. And that would be an admission of powerlessness. Institutions do not willingly declare their own expiration dates, yet the prophecy persists. It circulates online, in books, in documentaries. Believers and skeptics alike debate its meaning, and with each passing year, as scandals mount, as attendance drops, as vocations dwindle, the idea that the church is in its final days feels less like prophecy and more like observation. People do not need Malachi to tell them something is ending. They can see it in empty pews and closed parishes. They can feel it in the growing distance between doctrine and lived experience. The prophecy simply gave that feeling a name and a number. What is perhaps most chilling is that Malachi himself did not live to see his prophecy published. He died in 1148, just 9 years after his vision. The document was sealed and forgotten. He never sought fame or influence from it. He did not use it to manipulate papal elections or claim authority. He simply wrote what he saw and entrusted it to the church. And the church, in turn, buried it for 4 centuries. Why? Perhaps because even then they understood what it meant, that every institution, no matter how powerful, no matter how sacred, has an ending written into its beginning, and some truths are too heavy to carry in daylight. So the prophecy waits. Whether Francis is the final pope or whether one more will come, the list is nearly complete. And when it ends, whether through collapse, reformation, or something no one has yet imagined, the question will not be whether Malachi was right. It will be why no one listened when there was still time to change course. The book of Revelation sits at the end of the New Testament like a sealed door. It is cryptic, violent, and filled with imagery so strange that scholars have spent centuries trying to decode it. 7 seals, 4 horsemen, a woman clothed with the sun, a beast rising from the sea, and a final battle between good and evil. For many believers, it is the roadmap to the end of the world. But what most do not know is that the version we read today is not complete. There are fragments, early manuscripts, and alternative texts that suggest entire sections were removed, rewritten, or deliberately obscured before the book was canonized in the 4th century. Revelation was written around 95 A.D. by a man named John, exiled on the island of Patmos. He claimed to have received visions directly from Christ, visions that revealed what must soon take place. The text was immediately controversial. Some early church fathers praised it as divinely inspired. Others rejected it outright, calling it too confusing, too dangerous, or even heretical. For nearly 300 years, Revelation was debated, and several versions of it circulated among Christian communities. When the canon of the New Testament was finally established at the councils of Hippo and Carthage in the late 4th century, one version was chosen. The others were suppressed. What happened to those other versions? Some were destroyed. Others were hidden in monasteries, copied in secret by scribes who believed the full text should be preserved. A few fragments have surfaced over the centuries, tucked inside codices, written in margins, or discovered in desert caves alongside other banned texts. And what these fragments reveal is unsettling. They contain passages that do not appear in the Bible we know today. Passages that name names, describe events with alarming specificity, and point to corruption within the church itself. One such fragment was found in the 19th century in a Coptic monastery in Egypt. It contained an additional chapter between what we now call Revelation 12 and 13. In this missing section, John describes a vision of the church fracturing into factions. Leaders rising who claim divine authority, but serve only themselves. And a great apostasy where those who wear the robes of Christ will betray his teachings. The language is direct, not symbolic. It names no individuals, but the description fits patterns that would repeat throughout church history. When scholars brought this fragment to the attention of the Vatican, it was dismissed as apocryphal, a later addition with no historical validity. But the manuscript was dated to the 3rd century, older than many accepted New Testament texts. Another lost section reportedly existed in a manuscript, once held in the library of Constantinople before it was burned during the 4th Crusade in 1204. Letters written by Byzantine theologians reference a passage in Revelation that describes 7 false churches, counterfeits built in the name of God but serving earthly power. According to these letters, the passage warned that these false churches would rise in Rome, Byzantium, and other great cities masquerading as the body of Christ while leading souls astray. If such a passage existed, it would have been explosive. It would have meant that Revelation itself warned against the very institutions claiming to uphold it. The question is why these sections were removed. The most common explanation offered by church historians is that early councils sought to eliminate texts that lacked apostolic authority or that contradicted established doctrine. But another explanation is simpler and darker. They were removed because they threatened the institution. A prophecy that warns of corruption within the church cannot be preached by that same church. It cannot be used to reinforce authority. It can only undermine it. So the offending passages were quietly excised, and the remaining text was carefully edited to focus on external enemies, beasts and dragons, and pagan empires. Rather than internal decay, there is also the matter of the 7 letters to the 7 churches at the beginning of Revelation. In the canonical version, Christ addresses the churches of Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. Each letter is a mix of praise and rebuke, warning the congregations to repent or face judgment. But some early manuscripts suggest there were originally more letters addressed to churches that no longer exist or whose names have been lost. One medieval commentary references a letter to the Church of Rome, a letter so harsh that it was removed from the text entirely. According to this commentary, the letter warned that Rome would become the seat of pride, that its leaders would love gold more than God, and that it would fall not by the sword but by its own corruption. If such a letter existed, its removal would make perfect sense. By the time the canon was finalized, Rome had become the center of Christian authority. To include a letter condemning Rome would have been unthinkable. So it was erased, and the 7 letters were left to stand as warnings to distant, long-dead congregations, safe and neutered by time. Then there is the ending. The final chapter of Revelation describes a new heaven and a new earth, the new Jerusalem descending from God, and the promise that those who overcome will inherit eternal life. But some scholars believe the book originally ended differently. A text discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, though not identical to Revelation, shares striking similarities in structure and imagery. In that text, the final vision is not of a restored paradise, but of a long twilight, a period where believers must endure without clear signs, without miracles, waiting in faith as the world grows darker. If Revelation once carried a similar ending, it would have been far less comforting. And comfort for an institution trying to convert and retain believers is essential. The Vatican has never acknowledged that Revelation might be incomplete. Officially, the text is considered whole and divinely inspired, exactly as it appears in the Bible. But the existence of alternative manuscripts, early commentaries that reference missing passages, and the historical record of debates over which books to include all point to a more complex reality. Revelation was edited, and what was removed tells us as much about the Church's priorities as what was kept. What makes this particularly disturbing is that Revelation is not just any book. It is the book of endings. It claims to reveal the final act of human history, the ultimate fate of the world, and the return of Christ. If that book has been tampered with, if passages have been removed to protect institutional power, then what we are reading is not the full prophecy. It is a version deemed safe enough to publish. And the true prophecy the one that named the corruption, warned of false leaders, and described the church's own downfall, remains hidden. Some researchers believe fragments of the original text still exist, scattered across monastery libraries, private collections, and forgotten archives. Occasionally, a piece surfaces at auction or in a catalog of ancient manuscripts, but by the time scholars identify it, it often disappears again, purchased anonymously or reclassified as unavailable for study. The pattern suggests deliberate suppression, a quiet effort to keep the full text of Revelation from being reassembled. Why go to such lengths? Because prophecy is power. Whoever controls the text controls the interpretation. And if the full version of Revelation contains warnings about the church itself, then the church cannot afford to let it circulate. It would validate every critic, every reformer, every voice that has ever accused the institution of straying from its mission. It would confirm that the warning came not from heretics or enemies, but from within the sacred text itself. So Revelation remains what it has always been: a mystery, a puzzle with missing pieces, a prophecy that speaks in riddles and symbols, while the clearest passages, the ones that might have explained everything, sit locked in vaults or burned to ash centuries ago. And those who seek the full truth are left to wonder not just what the end will look like, but whether we are even reading the right map. Michel de Nostradame, known to history as Nostradamus, published his Prophecies in 1555. Written in cryptic 4-line verses called quatrains, they have been interpreted and reinterpreted for centuries. Some claim he predicted the French Revolution, the rise of Hitler, and even the September 11th attacks. Skeptics dismiss him as a charlatan whose vague language can be twisted to fit any event after the fact. But what few people know is that the quatrains we have are not complete. Nostradamus wrote far more than what was published, and some of his most disturbing predictions never made it into print. They were sent directly to the Vatican, and they never came back. Nostradamus was a physician, astrologer, and scholar living in southern France during a time of religious upheaval. The Protestant Reformation was tearing Europe apart. The Catholic Church was fighting to maintain control. And in that climate, a man claiming to see the future was dangerous. Nostradamus was careful. He wrote in symbols, anagrams, and riddles to avoid accusations of heresy. But he also wrote private letters addressed to kings, cardinals, and popes, letters that did not hide behind metaphor. One such letter was sent to Pope Pius IV in 1562. Historical records confirm its existence. It was carried by a trusted messenger and delivered into the hands of the papal secretary. What it contained has never been officially disclosed, but references to it appear in the journals of Vatican archivists and in the correspondence of church officials who saw it before it was sealed. According to these fragments, the letter warned of a future pope who would lead the church into darkness, a pontiff who would claim to serve God while serving only himself. It described a time when the faithful would lose trust in Rome, when priests would abandon their vows, and when the church itself would fracture under the weight of its own corruption. If that sounds familiar, it is because it mirrors what many believe to be the hidden message of the third secret of Fatima. Two prophecies, separated by centuries, pointing to the same event, the collapse of the church from within. But while Fatima was a vision given to children, Nostradamus was a scholar who studied astrology, ancient texts, and patterns in history. His predictions were not mystical. They were calculated, and that made them even more threatening. The Vatican's response to the letter was swift. It was classified, locked away, and never mentioned in public records. Nostradamus himself was summoned to Rome shortly after, though no official record of the meeting survives. What is known is that he stopped writing letters to the church after that visit. He returned to France, continued publishing his quatrains, and died in 1566. Whatever was said in that meeting, it silenced him on certain topics forever. But the letter was not the only prophecy Nostradamus set to the Vatican. According to research by Italian historian Roberto Pinotti, there exists a second document, a manuscript written in 1563, which Nostradamus labeled the final century. It was a timeline, not in verse but in prose, detailing events from the 16th century onward until the year 2070. The manuscript allegedly contained specific dates, descriptions of wars, plagues, and technological advancements, and a final section describing the end of organized religion as humanity had known it. Pinotti claims the manuscript was purchased by a Vatican envoy in 1629 and has been held in the secret archives ever since. Attempts to verify this have been met with silence. The Vatican does not confirm or deny the existence of such a document. Requests for access are declined, and researchers who press too hard find themselves quietly excluded from future access to the archives. The pattern is familiar. If the document does not exist, why not simply say so? Why the careful avoidance, the bureaucratic walls, the refusal to engage? Silence, once again, speaks louder than denial. What makes Nostradamus particularly dangerous to the Church is his method. Unlike biblical prophets who claimed divine inspiration, Nostradamus studied cycles, patterns in history, astronomy, and human behavior. He believed the future was not fixed, but probabilistic, that certain events would repeat because human nature does not change. That approach makes his predictions harder to dismiss as superstition. If he saw patterns leading to the collapse of the Church, those patterns can be verified. They can be checked against history. And if they hold, then his predictions about the future carry weight that mystical visions do not. One quatrain from his published work, Century 10, Quatrain 65, has long puzzled interpreters. It reads, O vast Rome, thy ruin approaches, not of thy walls, but of thy blood and substance. The harsh one of letters will make a very horrible notch. Pointed steel driven into all, up to the hilt. Many have tried to connect this to invasions or wars. But another interpretation, one whispered among those who study Vatican prophecies, is that it refers to internal collapse. The ruin of Rome not by armies, but by scandal, corruption, and exposure. The harsh one of letters could be documents, leaks, whistleblowers, and the pointed steel driven to the hilt could be truths so sharp they cannot be withdrawn, once spoken God in recent decades. That interpretation has gained traction. The Church has faced waves of scandal, financial corruption, sexual abuse cover-ups, power struggles within the Vatican itself. Each revelation another blade, each scandal another wound. And the structure, though still standing, grows weaker. Nostradamus may not have needed mystical visions to see this coming. He only needed to understand that institutions built on secrecy and power eventually collapse under the weight of their own contradictions. There is another quatrain, Century 5, Quatrain 56, that reads, "Through the death of a very old pontiff, a Roman of good age will be elected. It will be said of him that he weakens the Holy See, but long will he sit in inviting activity." Some believe this refers to Pope Francis, elected at age 76, the oldest pope chosen in centuries. Whether he weakens the Holy See or strengthens it through reform is still debated. But the phrase, biting activity, suggests conflict, controversy, and a papacy that does not bring peace but division. What is most chilling is not any single quatrain, but the cumulative picture they paint. A church in decline, a Rome weakened from within, leaders who claim holiness but act in self-interest, and a final period where the faithful abandon the institution, not because they lose faith in God, but because they lose faith in those who claim to represent him. If the Vatican holds documents from Nostradamus that spell this out in clearer terms, that name names or give dates, then the prophecy is not a warning. It is a countdown. Why would the Vatican keep such documents? Some argue it is to prevent panic. If believers knew the Church had a prophesied expiration date, they might leave en masse. Better to keep the knowledge locked away and hope the prediction is wrong. Others suggest the documents are kept as leverage, studied in secret by those who want to understand the timeline and perhaps alter it. If you know when the crisis will come, you can prepare. You can shift resources, change leadership, or manipulate events to avoid the worst outcomes. But there is a third possibility, that the Vatican keeps these prophecies not to prevent them, but to control the narrative when they unfold. When the collapse comes, and if it comes in the way Nostradamus described, the Church can claim it was foretold, that it is part of a divine plan, and that what rises from the ashes is the true Church, purified and renewed. Prophecy, in that sense, becomes a tool not of warning but of justification. Nostradamus died over 450 years ago. His quatrains remain best-sellers, debated endlessly, interpreted in 1,000 ways. But the text he sent to the Vatican, the private letters and manuscripts he entrusted to the Church, remain hidden. Perhaps they are forgeries or exaggerations or simply lost to time. Or perhaps they sit in a vault beneath Rome, catalogued under a number with no name, waiting for the moment when history catches up to the words he wrote centuries ago. And when that moment comes, the question will not be whether he was right. It will be whether anyone who could have acted on his warnings chose to ignore them. In 1961, in a small village in northern Spain called Garabandon, 4 young girls claimed they saw the Virgin Mary. It was not the first time such a thing had been reported, and it would not be the last. But what made Garabandal different was the specificity of the messages, the duration of the apparitions, and the Church's determination to bury them. For over 4 years the girls experienced visions, trances, and ecstasies witnessed by thousands of people, including priests, doctors, and government officials. Cameras documented their experiences. Medical tests were performed. Skeptics came to debunk them and left unsettled. Yet, despite all of this, the Vatican refused to recognize the events, and the messages the girls claimed to receive were never officially acknowledged. The 4 girls, Conchita Gonzalez, Jacinta Gonzalez, Mari Loli Mazon, and Mari Cruz Gonzalez ranged in age from 11 to 12 when the visions began. They described seeing a beautiful lady surrounded by light who identified herself as the Virgin Mary. Over the course of 2,000 apparitions, the figure delivered messages, warnings, and predictions. Some were personal, others were dire prophecies meant for the world, and one message in particular was so disturbing that it was never spoken aloud in full. The girls were told to keep it secret until a specified time, a time that according to them has not yet arrived. The public messages from Garabandal centered on themes of repentance, prayer, and the need for humanity to return to God before it was too late. But woven into those messages were warnings about the church itself. The Virgin reportedly told the girls that many cardinals, bishops, and priests were on the road to perdition, taking souls with them. She warned that the Eucharist was being treated with less reverence, that the sacraments were being diluted, and that a great confusion would descend upon the faithful. These were not vague spiritual warnings. They were pointed critiques of the clergy and the institution. When local priests reported these messages to church authorities, the response was swift and cold. Investigations were launched, not to validate the visions, but to discredit them. The girls were interrogated separately, pressured to recant, and accused of lying or being influenced by outside forces. When they refused to change their testimony, the church shifted tactics. Official statements declared the events lacked supernatural character. Pilgrimages to Garabandal were discouraged. Priests who supported the visions were silenced or transferred, and the village, once flooded with visitors, slowly faded from public attention. But the prophecies did not fade. The girls, now adults, have never recanted. Conchita, in particular, has maintained her account despite decades of pressure, scrutiny, and personal cost. She has given interviews, written memoirs, and repeated the same story without deviation. And the content of that story, especially the secret messages, continues to unsettle those who study it. One of the most discussed elements of Garabandal is the prophecy of the warning, the miracle, and the chastisement. According to the girls, the Virgin foretold 3 major events that would occur in sequence. The warning would be a supernatural phenomenon visible to everyone on earth simultaneously, a moment of divine illumination where each person would see the state of their soul as God sees it. It would not be physical punishment, but spiritual awakening, a chance for humanity to recognize its sins and repent. The miracle would follow, a visible and undeniable sign at Garabandal that would leave a permanent mark, a supernatural event so clear that no one could deny its divine origin. And if humanity still did not change, the chastisement would come, a period of suffering and destruction, meant to purify the world. The Vatican has never commented on these prophecies directly, but the timeline they suggest is unsettling because it mirrors other hidden prophecies from Fatima, from Akita in Japan, and from private revelations given to saints and mystics over the centuries. All describe a moment of reckoning, a point where the Church and the world face a crisis unlike any before. And all suggest that the crisis is not distant, but imminent. What makes Garabandal especially dangerous to the Church is that the messages do not come from ancient manuscripts or symbolic visions. They come from living witnesses who can be questioned, who have been medically examined and whose experiences were documented in real time. There is footage of the girls in ecstasy, their eyes fixed on something invisible, their bodies rigid, insensible to pain. Doctors tested them, pricking them with needles, shining lights in their eyes, and found no response. Whatever they were experiencing, it was not fabricated, yet the church dismissed it. Why? One reason is that the messages were too critical. To accept Garabandal would mean accepting that the Virgin Mary herself was condemning large portions of the clergy. It would mean acknowledging that something was deeply wrong within the institution. And institutions do not validate their own critics. Even when those critics claim divine authority, there is also the matter of the secret. Conchita was given a specific message that she was told to reveal only when instructed, by the Virgin or 8 days before the miracle occurs. She has hinted at its content over the years, describing it as related to the end times, the Church, and events that will unfold in a specific sequence. But she has never revealed it fully. The Vatican, according to some researchers, has privately requested she disclose it to them. She has refused, stating that her instructions were clear and that she will only speak when the time is right. This puts the Church in an impossible position. If the secret contains a prophecy about the Church's downfall, its corruption, or its final days, and if it becomes public at a moment of crisis, it could ignite a collapse of faith. But if the Church tries to suppress Conchita or discredit her before the secret is revealed, it only fuels suspicion that they fear what she knows. So the strategy has been silence. Do not endorse, do not condemn. Simply let time erode the memory until Garabandal becomes a footnote. But time has not eroded it. New generations discover the story. Documentaries are made. Witnesses, now elderly, continue to testify. And the prophecies, rather than fading, feel more relevant with each passing year. The confusion within the Church, the loss of faith among clergy, the scandals and divisions, all of it echoes what the girls said they were told in 1961. Then there is the question of the miracle. If it occurs, if something undeniable manifests at Garabandal that cannot be explained away, then the entire prophecy becomes validated. The warning, the miracle, the chastisement, all of it moves from speculation to reality. And the Church, which spent decades dismissing the visions, will have to explain why it ignored a warning that turned out to be true. Some believe the warning has already begun, not as a single event, but as a slow awakening, a growing awareness of corruption and lies within institutions people once trusted. Others believe it is still to come, a sudden global experience that will shake every soul. But either way, Garabandal stands as one of the most thoroughly documented and systematically suppressed prophecies in modern history. The girls, now in their 70s, continue to live quiet lives. They do not seek fame or profit from their experiences. They simply wait, as they have always waited, for the fulfillment of what they were told. And the Church, which once sent investigators to silence them, now watches from a distance, perhaps hoping the story fades, or perhaps quietly preparing for the possibility that it will not. What cannot be denied is this: Garabandal's messages align too closely with other suppressed prophecies to be dismissed as coincidence. Whether the source was divine, psychological, or something else entirely, the content points to the same crisis: a church losing its way, a clergy corrupted by power, and a moment of reckoning that will separate truth from institution, faith from structure, believers from the systems built to contain them. The only question is whether that moment has already begun or whether the worst is still ahead. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd boy threw a stone into a cave near the Dead Sea and heard the sound of breaking pottery. What he found inside changed biblical scholarship forever. Hidden in clay jars were ancient scrolls, over 2,000 years old, containing texts that predated the oldest known copies of the Hebrew Bible by a millennium. Over the next decade, more caves were discovered, yielding hundreds of manuscripts. They included books of the Bible, community rules, hymns, and commentaries. But they also contained something else: prophecies, visions of the future, written by a sect of Jews living in isolation, waiting for the end of days. And some of those prophecies have never been fully published. The scrolls were found in 11 caves around Qumran, a site believed to have been home to the Essenes, a Jewish sect that rejected the temple priesthood in Jerusalem as corrupt. They retreated to the desert to live in purity, study Scripture, and prepare for what they called the war of the sons of light against the sons of darkness. Their writings describe a coming apocalypse, a final battle, and the arrival of messianic figures who would overthrow the wicked and establish a new covenant. These were not just theological musings. They were detailed battle plans, timelines, and descriptions of events they believed would unfold in their near future. When scholars began translating the scrolls, the excitement was immense. Here was direct evidence of Jewish thought in the centuries just before Christianity emerged. The texts shed light on the origins of early Christian beliefs, the development of messianic expectations, and the religious landscape of first-century Palestine. But as the translations progressed, something strange happened. Certain texts were held back. Publication slowed. Access was restricted. And a small group of scholars, many with ties to the Vatican and other religious institutions, controlled which texts were released and when. For decades, this monopoly on the scrolls was justified as necessary for careful scholarship. But critics argued it was censorship. They pointed out that texts which aligned comfortably with traditional Christian theology were published quickly, while those that challenged or contradicted church doctrine remained locked away. By the 1990s, pressure from independent researchers forced the release of most of the remaining texts. But even then, some fragments were withheld, classified as too damaged to translate or too fragmentary to be meaningful. Yet leaked photographs and partial transcriptions suggest otherwise. One such text is known among researchers as 4Q390, sometimes called the Apocryphon of Jeremiah. It describes a vision of Israel's future, including the coming of false priests who will defile the sanctuary, the scattering of the faithful, and a period of 70 weeks of years, a timeline echoed in the book of Daniel. But unlike Daniel, this text goes further. It names the false priesthood, describes their corruption in explicit terms, and predicts that they will be overthrown not by foreign armies but by the faithful rising up from within. If this text was widely known, it would provide ancient Jewish precedent for the idea that religious institutions can become so corrupt they must be dismantled and rebuilt. Another controversial scroll is the War Scroll, officially designated 1QM, This text outlines a 40-year apocalyptic war between the forces of light and darkness. It includes detailed descriptions of battle formations, priestly rituals performed during combat, and prayers to be recited before engaging the enemy. But what makes it unsettling is the identity of the enemy. The sons of darkness are not just foreign nations. They include the Kittim, a term scholars believe referred to the Romans, but also the congregation of the wicked, which some interpret as the corrupt priesthood in Jerusalem. The text suggests that the final war would not just be against external oppressors, but against internal betrayers within the religious establishment. The Vatican's interest in the Dead Sea Scrolls has always been intense. When the scrolls were first discovered, Catholic scholars were among the first granted access. Father Roland de Vaux, a Dominican priest, led the excavation at Qumran and controlled much of the early publication process. His interpretations shaped how the world understood the scrolls for decades. Critics have since accused him of downplaying connections between the Essenes and early Christianity, particularly any suggestions that Jesus or John the Baptist may have been influenced by or even part of the Qumran community. Such connections would complicate the narrative of Christianity as a unique, divinely inspired revelation. There is also the matter of messianic prophecies in the scrolls. The Essenes expected not one Messiah, but two, a priestly Messiah and a kingly Messiah. This dual messianic expectation does not fit neatly with Christian doctrine, which holds that Jesus fulfilled all messianic roles. Some scroll fragments describe a teacher of righteousness who was persecuted and possibly killed by a corrupt priest. The parallels to Jesus are striking, but so is the possibility that this figure lived a century before Jesus, suggesting the gospel narrative may have been shaped by earlier Jewish traditions rather than being entirely original. One of the most suppressed aspects of the scrolls is their apocalyptic timeline. Several texts attempt to calculate when the end would come, using symbolic numbers, jubilee cycles, and interpretations of biblical prophecy. Some of these calculations pointed to dates that have long since passed, which makes them easy to dismiss. But others used frameworks that, when adjusted for calendar differences, point to dates in the near future. If those calculations were widely known, they could fuel apocalyptic movements, undermine confidence in church authority, or lead believers to question why the end has not yet come as the ancient prophets predicted. Then there is the question of the fragments still unreleased. In 2002, Israeli archaeologist Hanan Eshel reported that additional scroll fragments existed in private collections and Vatican archives, material that had never been cataloged or studied publicly. He claimed that some of these fragments contained prophecies so specific that their publication would be explosive. He died in 2010, and his claims have never been verified. Attempts to locate the fragments he described have been unsuccessful. They may not exist, or they may simply be buried deeper than anyone is willing to dig. The most chilling possibility is that the Dead Sea Scrolls contain a prophecy that has already come true, but was never meant to be recognized. Imagine a text written 2,000 years ago describing the rise of a global religious institution, its corruption, its wealth, and its eventual collapse. Imagine it describing scandals, schisms, and a faithful remnant forced to flee into spiritual wilderness. If such a text exists, and if scholars in the Vatican recognized it as describing the Catholic Church itself, they would have every reason to bury it. Because prophecy is only safe when it points to someone else. What cannot be denied is that the Essenes believed their own time was the end time. They saw corruption in Jerusalem, retreat into purity, and waited for divine intervention. When that intervention did not come in the way they expected, their community dissolved. Their scrolls were hidden in caves, perhaps hoping future generations would understand what they had seen. 2,000 years later, we have those scrolls, but we do not have all of them, and the ones we do have tell us that waiting for the end is nothing new. Every generation sees the signs. Every age believes it is the last. And every institution that grows powerful enough eventually faces the same prophecy, that it will fall, not by external force, but by its own weight. The Dead Sea Scrolls are not just ancient history. They are a mirror. They show us a community that saw corruption, withdrew, and prophesied collapse. And the fact that some of those prophecies remain hidden suggests that the pattern they describe is still too recognizable, still too dangerous, still too true. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd boy threw a stone into a cave near the Dead Sea and heard the sound of breaking pottery. What he found inside changed biblical scholarship forever. Hidden in clay jars were ancient scrolls, over 2,000 years old, containing texts that predated the oldest known copies of the Hebrew Bible by a millennium. Over the next decade, more caves were discovered, yielding hundreds of manuscripts. They included books of the Bible, community rules, hymns, and commentaries. But they also contained something else: prophecies. Visions of the future written by a sect of Jews living in isolation, waiting for the end of days. And some of those prophecies have never been fully published. The scrolls were found in 11 caves around Qumran, a site believed to have been home to the Essenes, a Jewish sect that rejected the temple priesthood in Jerusalem as corrupt. They retreated to the desert to live in purity, study Scripture, and prepare for what they called the war of the sons of light against the sons of darkness. Their writings describe a coming apocalypse, a final battle, and the arrival of messianic figures who would overthrow the wicked and establish a new covenant. These were not just theological musings. They were detailed battle plans, timelines, and descriptions of events they believed would unfold in their near future. When scholars began translating the scrolls, the excitement was immense. Here was direct evidence of Jewish thought in the centuries just before Christianity emerged. The texts shed light on the origins of early Christian beliefs, the development of messianic expectations, and the religious landscape of first-century Palestine. But as the translations progressed, something strange happened. Certain texts were held back, publications slowed, access was restricted, and a small group of scholars, many with ties to the Vatican and other religious institutions, controlled which texts were released and when, for decades. This monopoly on the scrolls was justified as necessary for careful scholarship, but critics argued it was censorship. They pointed out that texts which aligned comfortably with traditional Christian theology were published quickly, while those that challenged or contradicted church doctrine remained locked away. By the 1990s, pressure from independent researchers forced the release of most of the remaining texts. But even then, some fragments were withheld, classified as too damaged to translate or too fragmentary to be meaningful. Yet leaked photographs and partial transcriptions suggest otherwise. One such text is known among researchers as 4Q390, sometimes called the Apocryphon of Jeremiah. It describes a vision of Israel's future, including the coming of false priests who will defile the sanctuary, the scattering of the faithful, and a period of 70 weeks of years, a timeline echoed in the book of Daniel. But unlike Daniel, this text goes further. It names the false priesthood, describes their corruption in explicit terms, and predicts that they will be overthrown not by foreign armies but by the faithful rising up from within. If this text was widely known, it would provide ancient Jewish precedent for the idea that religious institutions can become so corrupt they must be dismantled and rebuilt. Another controversial scroll is the War Scroll, officially designated 1QM. This text outlines a 40-year apocalyptic war between the forces of light and darkness. It includes detailed descriptions of battle formations, priestly rituals performed during combat, and prayers to be recited before engaging the enemy. But what makes it unsettling is the identity of the enemy. The sons of darkness are not just foreign nations. They include the Kittim, a term scholars believe referred to the Romans, but also the congregation of the wicked, which some interpret as the corrupt priesthood in Jerusalem. The text suggests that the final war would not just be against external oppressors, but against internal betrayers within the religious establishment. The Vatican's interest in the Dead Sea Scrolls has always been intense. When the scrolls were first discovered, Catholic scholars were among the first granted access. Father Roland de Vaux, a Dominican priest, led the excavation at Qumran and controlled much of the early publication process. His interpretations shaped how the world understood the scrolls for decades. Critics have since accused him of downplaying connections between the Essenes and early Christianity, particularly any suggestions that Jesus or John the Baptist may have been influenced by or even part of the Qumran community. Such connections would complicate the narrative of Christianity as a unique, divinely inspired revelation. There is also the matter of messianic prophecies in the scrolls. The Essenes expected not one Messiah, but two, a priestly Messiah and a kingly Messiah. This dual messianic expectation does not fit neatly with Christian doctrine, which holds that Jesus fulfilled all messianic roles. Some scroll fragments describe a teacher of righteousness who was persecuted and possibly killed by a corrupt priest. The parallels to Jesus are striking, but so is the possibility that this figure lived a century before Jesus, suggesting the gospel narrative may have been shaped by earlier Jewish traditions rather than being entirely original. One of the most suppressed aspects of the scrolls is their apocalyptic timeline. Several texts attempt to calculate when the end would come, using symbolic numbers, jubilee cycles, and interpretations of biblical prophecy. Some of these calculations pointed to dates that have long since passed, which makes them easy to dismiss. But others used frameworks that, when adjusted for calendar differences, point to dates in the near future. If those calculations were widely known, they could fuel apocalyptic movements, undermine confidence in church authority, or lead believers to question why the end has not yet come as the ancient prophets predicted. Then there is the question of the fragments still unreleased. In 2002, Israeli archaeologist Hanan Eshel reported that additional scroll fragments existed in private collections and Vatican archives, material that had never been cataloged or studied publicly. He claimed that some of these fragments contained prophecies so specific that their publication would be explosive. He died in 2010, and his claims have never been verified. Attempts to locate the fragments he described have been unsuccessful. They may not exist, or they may simply be buried deeper than anyone is willing to dig. The most chilling possibility is that the Dead Sea Scrolls contain a prophecy that has already come true, but was never meant to be recognized. Imagine a text written 2,000 years ago describing the rise of a global religious institution, its corruption, its wealth, and its eventual collapse. Imagine it describing scandals, schisms, and a faithful remnant forced to flee into spiritual wilderness. If such a text exists, and if scholars in the Vatican recognized it as describing the Catholic Church itself, they would have every reason to bury it, because prophecy is only safe when it points to someone else. What cannot be denied is that the Essenes believed their own time was the end time. They saw corruption in Jerusalem, retreat into purity, and waited for divine intervention. When that intervention did not come in the way they expected, their community dissolved. Their scrolls were hidden in caves, perhaps hoping future generations would understand what they had seen. 2,000 years later, we have those scrolls, but we do not have all of them, and the ones we do have tell us that waiting for the end is nothing new. Every generation sees the signs. Every age believes it is the last. And every institution that grows powerful enough eventually faces the same prophecy, that it will fall not by external force but by its own weight. The Dead Sea Scrolls are not just ancient history. They are a mirror. They show us a community that saw corruption, withdrew, and prophesied collapse. And the fact that some of those prophecies remain hidden suggests that the pattern they describe is still too recognizable, still too dangerous, still too true.